Hi, in this video, I'm going to go over game 3 from LSAT Prep Test 22. So this one is a spatial game, and those are quite rare and also seem to have been phased out. So you're not going to see many spatial games at all in all of the prep tests, but particularly in the more recent ones. So the higher numbered prep tests, we just really don't see spatial reasoning at all. So yeah, just keep that in mind. It's not high priority as a game type, but if you've already given it a try and you want to understand how it works, then yeah, um, feel free to keep watching. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's how the paintings are arranged. Each of them is either oil or watercolor, and we're not told how many are oil and how many are watercolor, so that's completely unknown. We don't want to assume just because we have 6 paintings and 2 options for each of them that there's like an even split of 3 oils and 3 watercolors. We don't know at this point. Okay. Rule 2 is that each oil is directly beside, above, or below another oil. So uh, for an oil painting, um, we would have an oil like here or here or here, here, here. And it could be uh, like in any of those um, positions, like would be enough. The thing that isn't going to fulfill that is if we have one that is like diagonally next to it. I would call that kitty corner. But yeah, that diagonal, that's not going to fulfill that second condition. It needs to be directly beside, either directly to the left or directly to the right, or it has to be right above or right below. And it could be multiple of those, but at least one of them. And then the same thing is true for watercolors. So I'm just going to visually represent that in the same way. Each painting is 19th or 20th, and again, we don't know how many we have of each. And then that rule about the orientation, right, beside, above, below, applies to each of these centuries as well. So we can draw that same thing out. And yeah, I mean, any way that you want to represent this is fine, as long as you get to the same um, understanding of the rule. So I'm not a big stickler for notation. Spatial games in particular, there isn't necessarily a correct notation. It's just making sure that you have something that visually represents what's going on, and then you can actually apply it appropriately to the questions. Painting 2 is 19th century. So if I create my little diagram here, painting 2 is this one. So it's going to be 19th century. Okay. Painting 3 is an oil. And painting 5 is 20th century. Okay. So yeah, I mean, at that point, we don't know for sure how we're going to fulfill these conditions with that information. It's not totally clear. So we're going to need more information. And you'll see even the first question has a question specific condition. So I would just dive right in, add that question specific condition, and see what I can deduce from that. All right, so question 15. If the 19th century paintings are watercolors, then what must be true? Okay, so that would mean that painting 2 is a watercolor. Um, since painting 3 is an oil and it has to be either next to or above or below another oil, um, painting 6 is going to have to be an oil to fulfill that condition. So that is handy. Um, if all of the 19th century ones are watercolors, that also means that if it's not a watercolor, it has to be from the 20th century rather than the 19th. So what I'm doing there is I'm creating the contrapositive of this condition, right? And so I'm flipping, putting watercolor at the front, 19th at the back, and negating both of them. So if it's not a watercolor, it's not from the 19th century. And because we only have 2 options, either 19th or 20th, if it's not 19th, that means the same thing as saying it's 20th. Yeah, so if it's not watercolor, which 3 and 6 are both oil, those guys both have to be 20th century paintings. We also know that this one here is 20th century always, but just because it's from the 20th century doesn't mean that it's not a watercolor, right? So we know that all the 19th century ones are watercolors, and we know that if it's not a watercolor or it's an oil, then it's not from the 19th century, which means the same thing as it's from the 20th. But just because it's a watercolor doesn't necessarily mean it's from the 19th century. And just because it's from the 20th century doesn't necessarily mean it's an oil. So this is a conditional reasoning, uh, I guess, lesson. So if that's something that doesn't make a lot of sense, then definitely spend some more time working on conditional reasoning specifically. Okay. All right. So we've deduced everything that we can, I believe, in this little diagram here. So does painting 1, this one, have to be an oil? No, no, there's no reason it has to be an oil. We don't know anything about it. Painting 3, does painting 3 have to be 19th century? No, actually, it has to be 20th. So we can eliminate B. 4 is a watercolor. We don't know anything about painting 4. Painting 5 is an oil. No, that would be a mistake, right? So that would be assuming that just because it's 20th century, it has to be oil. And that would be a mistaken negation of the condition up here. Okay, so E has to be the correct answer, right? Painting 6 does have to be a 20th century painting. And we got that because we know that it has to be an oil painting, because if 2 is a watercolor, painting 3 has to have an oil beside it. And so the only spot where it could have an oil right next to it is if painting 6 is an oil. We know that if it's 19th century, it's a watercolor, and if it's not a watercolor, it's not 19th century. So oils are not watercolors. Therefore, it's not 19th century, it has to be 20th century. So quite a few deductions, and even in that first question to get to the correct answer. Definitely more challenging than your typical first question on a game. All right, let's erase this, get back to our original diagram here. And question 16. It is possible that the only 2 watercolors among the 6 paintings are which ones? So the 2 watercolors are going to have to be in like one of these arrangements. And we know that painting 3 here is an oil painting. So it can't include 3, but it doesn't look like that's happening. So 1 and 5 are diagonal. So it's not A. 1 and 6 are way across from each other. That's not going to work. It's not B. Painting 2 and 4, again, diagonal, that's not gonna work. Painting 4 and 5, yeah, that would be okay. We could have painting 4 and 5 be the only two watercolors. So we have watercolor, watercolor, oil, 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 like that. That would be okay. And 4 and 6, yeah, they're right. They're not directly next to each other. So yeah, D, 4 and 5. That one's actually, I think, easier than question 15. Okay. We're just getting a blank slate so we can look at question 17. If there are exactly 3 oils and 3 watercolors, what has to be true? Okay, 3 oils and 3 watercolors. So how could they be arranged so that every oil is next to another oil, every watercolor is next to another watercolor? So I would just start drawing out options. So that's one option. We know oil's always going to be in that corner. So it could have these two next to it. It could have just this one next to it, and then this would be another oil. And then we'd have our watercolors filling out the rest of the space. Yeah, it's definitely looking like the only one that has to be watercolor is this spot down here that's like really far away from the one that we know has to be an oil, right? So that would kind of make sense. And that's painting 4, that one would have to be a watercolor. We can test it to see if there's a way to make it an oil painting and for like this whole thing to work. So if we test it, we make it an oil painting, and this one is an oil painting. Yeah, it's just not going to work, right? So we have one more oil painting that we can place. There has to be one that's next to this one and also that's next to this one, and there's just no spot that fulfills that. If we put it here, then this one's all on its own. If we put it here, then this one's all on its own. It's just not going to work. So we've tested it, and we know now that painting 4 does absolutely have to be a watercolor. So that's the correct answer, C. Right. Question 18. If exactly 2 paintings are oils, okay, so 2 oils would mean 4 watercolors, and 2 paintings are 19th century, which means 4 of them are 20th century. Okay. Which one of the following must be false? All right, so if we only have 2 oils, we know 2 or 6 definitely has to be an oil. So that, yeah, so that oil in the corner in position 3 has another oil next to it. So that's kind of good to know. 1, 4, and 5 can't be oils. So if we see anything that says that those guys are oils, then we know that it's not true. We also know that 19th century has to be, so 1, which is this one here, right? Or 3 or 5 has to be 19th century. Okay, so exactly one of those is going to be 19th century. And it matter which one. Oh, 5 can't be 19th century, sorry. We already know that that's 20th. So either 1 or 3 is going to be the 19th century. But 1 or 3 is 19th century, and 2 or 6 is an oil. And we know that anything that's not 1, 2, or 3 can't be 19th century. So 1 is 19th century, 6 is an oil, that's fine. 2 is 19th century and an oil. Yeah, 2 has to be 19th century, so that's fine. 3 is 19th century. Yeah, that's fine. So we're eliminating the ones that are okay, right? This is a must be false question, so we're eliminating everything that could be true. So we've eliminated A, B, and C. 1 and 2 are both 19th century. Yeah, that's okay, because we already know that 2 is 19th century and 1 can be as well. 2 is an oil and 4 is 19th century. Yeah, 4 can't be 19th century. That's the problem. So E is the one that must be false. Okay, moving on to question 19, which is a could be true question. So we're just looking for something that's possible. Okay. So question 19. What could be true? Could 1 and 4 be 2 of exactly 3 20th century paintings? Sure. 20, 20. Let's see what would be wrong with that. The others would be 19th. I think A is the correct answer. Yeah, A. Okay. Great. All right. If you want any follow-up videos on this one, just let me know. But like I said, spatial reasoning is not really tested anymore. Other aspects of this definitely would be. So like the conditional reasoning is definitely tested quite a bit. So if that was like an aspect that you struggled with this one, then for sure make sure that you're doing more work on that. But like the spatial elements of it, like this part with, you know, whoa, above and all that stuff, that's not, yeah, that's not really tested. Circular games have come up. So I think that's the one way that spatial reasoning sort of gets in. I've done a couple videos on circle games. But yeah, if you have questions about that, just let me know. All right, I'm gonna move on and make another video. So hope this helps. Thanks.